The opposition and government there with very different framings ahead of tomorrow's budget. This year, the government unveiled a lot of that budget in the weeks leading up to its introduction in the House of Commons, hoping the spending plan will pack extra punch for them after a rough slide in the polls. So far, there's been a myriad of announcements focused on dramatically increasing the supply of houses, making rent cheaper, a national school lunch program, as you heard referenced in that exchange. There's defense spending, as well as a new AI strategy. What's left and what should we be watching for tomorrow? Let's bring in the front bench to talk about that. Former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, Dan Moulton is here. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Shakir Chambers worked in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office before becoming a policy advisor to the International Trade Minister. He's now a principal at Earnscliffe Strategies. Kathleen Monk is the former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. She's now the principal owner of Monk & Associates. And Laura Stone is a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hello, everyone. Happy Budget Eve. Dan, I'll start with you. A very simple question. From a policy perspective, what are you watching for tomorrow?
Well, I think we've seen the government, as you mentioned, roll out a very strong array of spending commitments over the last several weeks. And so tomorrow, I think most eyes are going to be on the revenue side of the equation. We started to see some of that leaking out today and over the last few days in terms of some taxes that are targeted at wealthiest Canadians, at industries perhaps that consumers find irritating at the moment, to borrow some terminology the government started to use. I really think that will be the key question tomorrow, is how far do they go on the revenue side of the equation. I think there's a lot of really poorly kept secrets in this city about perhaps new corporate taxes, new taxes focused on the largest corporations or in industries that consumers are annoyed at the moment. We'll see if that comes to bear. I do think there is a fair amount of speculation out there that may be fueled with some leaking strategies, that when the budget's revealed tomorrow, private sector Canada is a little less upset than perhaps they are predicting they might be today. But the revenue side will be what I'm watching for tomorrow. Yeah,
I think Dan's right on the money, Kathleen, that we've now spent 2 weeks looking at what the spending is. Everyone's, using their calculator, and it becomes very obvious if you match that amount of spending with a pledge that the finance minister continues to make to stick to these fiscal anchors she set out, which include not growing the size of the deficit, there's got to be something else coming on the revenue end.
There's got to be. And my money right now is actually on a corporate tax rate increase. We've seen that Biden, from the State of the Union speech earlier this year, he said he was actually gunning for another 7% increase, bringing from 21 in the U.S. to 28. Right now, the U.S. is at 21. We're at 15. That's because under Harper's government, Prime Minister Harper, where Pierre Poilievre was the cabinet minister, they actually cut, 7 points off from 22, back to 15. So there's room to grow there. And there's actually, if they raise the rates between 20 to 21% from the 15 it currently is, they could be bringing in $16 billion a year extra. That could go to, that's a third of our, just for example, that's a third of our healthcare transfer, our federal healthcare transfer. It's around just above 40. We could actually shave a third of that off if we raise taxes. And why do I think that would be a good investment? Because corporations during the churn of the pandemic have made a fortune, right? That economic tumult that happened, they've made some money. If they want the productivity that Mr. Dodge was just talking about, if they actually want this, for wages to increase, for that kind of investment to be happening in the economy and the economy to grow, they need to be paying their fair share. And so I actually think that that's what's going to happen tomorrow. I think that we'll see some corporate tax increases.
To be fair, Shakir, wages have in the last 13 months outpaced the rate of inflation.
That's true.
At the same time, I think Kathleen's kind of hit the political nail on the head in that, and Dan touched on this as well, there's this coalescing of thought sort of targeting corporations recently. Boyd, I think not just by the Liberals and the NDP, but by the Conservatives too. We've spoken on this panel about the most recent speeches Pierre Poilievre made to corporate Canada, which were, not necessarily on the friendly side at all.
Yeah, I think, Pierre was talking about more of a consistency of message when you're addressing the Conservatives. I don't think he's talking about raising taxes on corporate America. Corporate Canada, sorry. And I think if the narrative tomorrow is tax increases, tax and spend, I think it's a big loss for the Liberals. I'm not so sure. We can talk about corporations being, making a lot of money, but when Jagmeet Singh asked Justin Trudeau to raise taxes on the grocers, Justin Trudeau said no because the cost is going to get passed on to Canadians anyway. So I'm not sure you can square that circle and say we're going to raise taxes on corporations and everything's going to be fine and well. I think even when you talk about raising taxes on the wealthy, I'm curious how they would define wealth, right? What does that mean in this economy? Who is actually considered wealthy? And I've read numerous articles from economists that even when you tax the wealthy, they just move their assets elsewhere. So I'm not so sure this whole strategy of tax increases is the way to pay for all these programs. I do think there's a large audience out here in Canada that wants to talk about, how do you reduce spending? How do you cut back on certain things? There's no doubt in my mind there's a large group of Canadians that think, there's a lot of money being wasted in Ottawa and even other capitals throughout Canada. How do we reduce that and get to a more fiscally responsible situation? I don't look at the Liberals, at least this iteration of the Liberals, and give them any credibility in terms of getting on a strong fiscal track moving forward. But again, if we're talking about raising taxes, that is a losing argument tomorrow.
Laura, what will you be watching for?
Taxes, and more taxes. As my esteemed panelists have said, look, I think there's kind of two schools of thought on this, right? It is the corporate tax side, and then this potential wealth tax side, and how do you define that? What is it? Is it set at a certain salary, and what does that mean in certain areas of the country where money may go a lot further than it does potentially in the Greater Toronto area? And how does the Liberal government sell this? There is some concern in the business community about if corporate taxes are increased, what does that mean for investment in this country? What does that mean for jobs? What does that mean for people's wages? How is the Liberal government going to sell that message? I guess I'm also looking for any additional affordability measures. Obviously, the housing plan is literally on the table. The government has released its full plan on Friday, and they've made a series of measures about increasing the housing supply and affordability. But on simply the affordability side, is there some sort of populist measure in there, some sort of shiny object that they can dangle in front of younger Canadians that say, look, as soon as this budget passes, you're going to get $200 back for this, or a tax credit for your kids' activities, or something like that, something that changes people's lives in the immediate. And I wonder if they're going to, I know they have kind of a big picture idea of how they're going to tackle the housing crisis, but is there something more immediate on the affordability front as well?
The interesting part as far as that goes, Dan, will be, they have said very loudly behind the scenes they're very concerned about exacerbating inflation and adding to the demand side in any way unless it's extremely targeted. Poses that risk. But to Laura's point, is the whole story just going to be taxes tomorrow, the revenue side, or will they put something else beyond what they've already announced in the window?
No, I think there'll be new news tomorrow as well on the spending side, or perhaps less on the spending side and more on what are they doing to fight for consumers, right? I think largely in the media landscape we now operate in, governments are seeking out tools to speak to voters in really direct and personal ways. And consumer industries, consumer experiences tend to be a way to do that. I think consumers across the country, particularly younger ones, are irritated by a lot of experiences they have with different consumer industries. Some of them are federally regulated, like banking, that give them easy tools, airlines as well. They give easy tools to the government from a experience and a cost standpoint, where they can reach into. And I think we've seen them challenging the provinces pretty directly in a bunch of different policy areas the last few weeks. And I think they're going to do the same thing in the consumer experience standpoint, because provinces simply haven't done enough in this area, they're going to say, and we're going to work with them to do more. So I'm looking for a lot of that tomorrow as well, because I think Laura's right. They have to speak directly to consumers in certain ways as well, that we understand your costs are really high and we're going to do something about it.
And I think just combining all those points to Shakir's point, if the entire story is we're raising taxes tomorrow, I don't imagine that that's the comms they hope out of it, Catherine.
No, but they could do something on junk fees, on bank junk fees. They could do stuff like that. I rember the 2012 budget, Harper's budget, was just awash with cuts. But what were people talking about? The fact that he eliminated the penny.
The penny.
So there's always that kind of, water cooler conversation happening. But just on the tax cuts quickly, there's a lot of focus, on the behavioral change. And people are always like, oh, but they'll move their money. And people like my dear colleague, Shakir, will throw up their hands saying you can't do that but actually the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, says there will be behavior change, but there can also be enforcement. And if you're willing to enforce and actually you can actually reap the benefits of those tax changes. So it can be done.
We don't have the best record on enforcing stuff
there
at the
can
CRA,
be
by
an
the way.
investment, and that can be done. So
There's that $30 billion of CERB that just flew out the door that they just don't want to get back. But
I also don't think the government's interested in looking anti-business right now, frankly. Right? Like, I don't think they're interested in looking like they're stalling economic.
I have to pause because we're going to keep the conversation going on exactly this point and the comms out of the budget and the politics attached to it with the front bench after a very short break. Stay right there.